Jordan Peterson and his guest Dr. Naomi Wolf discuss the history of infectious diseases and how they have been used as a pretext for eradicating liberties and consolidating control. Dr. Wolf notes that the model of narrating the danger of infectious diseases as a threat to society really took hold in the 19th century with the outbreaks of typhus and cholera, and has been used by authoritarian regimes ever since. The pandemic has seen a similar trend, with some governments using COVID-19 as an excuse to take away people's rights. Moving on, Peterson asked Dr. Wolf about her journey as a progressive thinker who has come under fire for becoming an anti-vaxxer and a conspiracy theorist. Dr. Wolf talks about her recent book, The Body Politic, which explores the authoritarian tendencies of governments during the COVID-19 pandemic. She also discusses the changing landscape of the left and the role that Marxist doctrines have played in shaping it. Peterson and Dr. Wolf discuss the phenomenon of cancel culture and why it seems to be more prevalent among those on the left. Peterson notes that he has had very few people on the right refuse to talk to him, while many on the left have. This tendency to cancel those with differing opinions can lead to infighting on the left, with people squabbling over increasingly smaller issues. Nonetheless, Dr. Wolf remains committed to engaging with those who have different perspectives, highlighting the importance of discussing issues of liberty, the Constitution, human rights, and freedom. Naomi Wolf then discusses how the Nazis started their extermination campaigns with public health campaigns that were effective in eliminating tuberculosis. The Nazis used a public health campaign to enlist medical professional associations, corral doctors, and made them moderators of racial hygiene. This helped in rounding up teenagers who were later sent off for treatment, and their families never saw them again. Hitler's doctrine of racial purity and blood purity was full of contamination language. Hitler was described as a worshiper of willpower, which is associated with authoritarian control. There's a tight relationship between the proclivity for authoritarian control and the exercise of power and will. The discussed response is part of the behavioral immune system associated with conscientiousness. In the last 4 or 5 years, something has changed in the culture, and the left has picked up the contamination frenzy and introduced it into extended immune-adjacent behaviors, like cancel culture, which is a form of disgust-related shunning. The left is exhibiting more shunning of others than ever before, forgetting all their principles, including critical thinking, civil free speech, and even associating with pharmaceutical companies that they previously considered reprehensible. Peterson and Naomi Wolf discuss how radical change is currently affecting society in ways that have never been experienced before. Peterson gives an example of how even a 2-year hiatus from technology can result in one's electronics becoming outdated and require time and effort to assimilate to the changes. This radical change is ultimately leading to the emergence of a strange kind of conservatism on the more open left, which wouldn't have been likely in a time when things were changing slower. However, in her experience, people who remain open-minded and willing to engage with facts that contradict the dominant narrative are currently conservatives and libertarians. Wolf mentions an increase in humor on the conservative and libertarian side, such as the emergence of the Babylon Bee, a conservative satire website. She suggests that the more libertarian and conservative comedians are currently the funniest and pulling in the largest audiences. Wolf believes that having spent her life on the left has temporarily lost its mind, and there is a lot more to make fun of. She further suggests that the left is more irrational now, believing in things that are not true or are not willing to admit they have been wrong. This rigidity and inability to re-examine facts or acknowledge the moral hole in the center of culture on the left has created a gap in the center of the culture. Furthermore, Wolf takes issue with the mandates of mRNA injections and reveals her team of experts has found them to be deadly and damaging, leading to a 2-tier society that ostracizes a whole sector of people and renders their travel plans impossible in some cases. Wolf suggests a moral hole in the center of culture on the left until they come to terms with the eradication of their cherished ideals, become oppressors, fundamentalists, and dogmatists, and abandon science and compassion. Naomi Wolf brings up the relationship between perceived sexual attractiveness and socioeconomic status. Peterson cites a study by David Buss, an evolutionary psychologist, showing that women preferentially mate across social hierarchies and up, while men mate across hierarchies and down. This association between socioeconomic status and mate attractiveness is higher for men perceiving women than women perceiving men. Peterson explains that one of the hallmarks of attractiveness is neotenic faces, which are associated with fecundity, particularly on the female side. The evolutionary tendency towards juvenile forms characterizes even animated characters, as Stephen Jay Gould established. Peterson then introduces Naomi Wolf's book, The Beauty Myth, and asks for her perspective on the biological markers of beauty and how they play into the ideal of women's sexual self-presentation. Wolf concedes that markers of health and attractiveness, such as symmetrical features and youth, are transcendental. However, she argues that almost all studies of evolutionary biologists tend to focus on these markers only in women and do not test what women find attractive in men. They construct surveys that tendentiously prove women find professional accomplishment or wealth attractive, which Wolf believes is a flawed conceptual assumption. Wolf argues that if women were asked what they find physically attractive in men, they would name broad shoulders, symmetry, muscle tone, and height as markers of attractiveness. Wolf also notes that using indicators of productive competence as markers of attractiveness is also a flawed assumption. She argues that there is a need to respect women's own criteria for deciding what constitutes a desirable partner. Wolf's stance comes from her feminist perspective as an analyst. Naomi Wolf believes that scientists avoid studying sexual attractiveness according to penis size as they don't want to draw unpopular conclusions. She argues that the whole field of evolutionary biology, concluding that sexual attractiveness is gendered female and that males have other proxies for sexual attractiveness, is convenient for men. She explains that men do not have to confront the physical things that women evaluate in men for heterosexual attraction. However, Jordan Peterson is not sure what kind of differential perception on the part of each sex is convenient for each sex. He argues that both sexes face advantages and disadvantages in the sexual battlefield. Peterson also highlights that women are much harsher in their sexual attractiveness evaluations of men than men are of women. Yet Wolf disagrees with this, indicating that rating men lower is an outdated perspective. Wolf believes that the field of evolutionary biology has little intellectual merit in explaining contemporary gender roles, expectations, or norms, as the circumstances that evolutionary biologists discuss happened historically. Instead, Wolf suggests the idea of adultery as advantageous for women, as it provides them with a diverse range of sperm. Peterson counters this argument, indicating that sophisticated evolutionary psychologists have already taken this into account. Nonetheless, Wolf argues that evolutionary biology gives males a kind of justification for polygamy or needing multiple sexual partners, which she finds tendentious. Naomi Wolf argues that the evolutionary biologist's narrative about women optimizing the value of their partners to compensate for their reproductive deficits by making them material providers is out of date. She believes that with the rise of economic opportunities for women, young men tend to find financially successful older women attractive, which is a phenomenon that did not exist before. Also, with modern childcare facilities, financially successful single mothers can afford to hire caregivers to assist them with their children, which was not possible in the past. However, Wolf adds that the value of men in contemporary society have gone down, which conflicts with the evolutionary biologist's narrative, and praises Peterson's work for highlighting the value of men in society. Peterson advises his male viewers to focus on being productive and generous to increase their chances of finding a mate. And Wolf agrees with this advice, stating that her husband was influenced by Peterson's work and that picking up the check was an attractive quality. Peterson argues that women favor men who can make money as it shows they are competent and self-sufficient. However, he also acknowledges that men are attracted to women who are competent too. The willingness and ability to reciprocate in a relationship is fundamental for it to be self-sustaining. Peterson also shares that a man appreciates a woman who can pick up a check, as it shows her willingness to reciprocate, which is a sign of confidence. Wolf adds that both genders surveil the landscape for someone who can reciprocate and support them. She feels that the modern-day woman must contribute and not be like the passive, inert idols of the past, like Twiggy. The pair agrees that reciprocity is the most important thing for a relationship to survive. Peterson suggests that it is not a new concept, as the name Eve in Hebrew means beneficial adversary, implying that the partner should be someone who can engage in provocative and challenging reciprocal play, not someone who passively submits to demands. They discuss how Valentinian society moved the ideal femininity towards passivity, but did not represent an eternal norm. Wolf argues that the modern era represents a return to pre-industrialization because of the Industrial Revolution, which made it possible for women to be the doll-like middle-class wives of the wealthy rather than active partners. She shares how a woman in America, where land acquisition happened, had to be capable of using a rifle if necessary, making American women independent. Before the Industrial Revolution, households had equally active female and male spheres. This traditional domestic life model is portrayed in the Old Testament, where the value of a woman is determined by her skills and abilities, such as weaving clothes, selling goods, and being morally righteous. Naomi Wolf argues that this model is still relevant today since women live longer than before, and their economic and social roles have expanded. Also, the challenge of having good mating habits extends and challenges both genders' skill sets, leading to personal growth. Jordan Peterson agrees and highlights that the biological marker for the optimization of information flow is the spirit of play and free, playful discourse. This also aligns with the erotic preferences many women have, where a man's sense of humor is highly valued because it activates their dopamine circuit in a way that complements their sexual response. This also implies that laughter puts one in a state of play, deactivating the musculature, and makes one attentive to time and place. Naomi Wolf engages in a conversation about the left cornering itself in the last decade and Wolf's motivation for writing her books. Peterson is interested in people's motivations as a clinical psychologist and asks Wolf about her central intellectual interest. Wolf reveals that through her book, The Beauty Myth, she analyzed the perceptual preconditions behind her being objectified and categorized as an attackable target, spurred on by her personal experience of being raped as a child. She clarifies that the beauty myth was an analysis of objectification, but not of sexual assault. Wolf's more recent work addresses her experiences of torture, violence, and surveillance, as these experiences are on the same continuum as those of sexual assault, and the bodily responses to these traumas can be similar. Peterson acknowledges Wolf's ability to turn stumbling blocks into opportunities to live a productive life, and their inability to cover the many other topics in this conversation due to lack of time. They then talk about the political front on the left in recent years, particularly in Wolf's reaction to the COVID-19 epidemic and what really happened, which she claims was an epidemic of imitating Chinese authoritarians. Peterson and Wolf agree that there isn't an obvious reason for this totalitarian behavior, making it all the more concerning. Peterson states, the COVID virus was the excuse for it, but not the reason. And Wolf echoes this by adding, and so that's really quite terrifying. They are referring to the fact that governments and individuals have used the pandemic as a reason to implement authoritarian measures and increase their power. However, Peterson and Wolf argue that this is not the real reason for this behavior, leading to an even more unsettling reality that there may not be a clear explanation for this totalitarianism. Naomi Wolf talks about her childhood, her upbringing, and her experience at Yale. Wolf talks about growing up in San Francisco surrounded by the cultural ferment of the 60s and 70s with social justice movements around her as she grew up. Being from California, a more inclusive society, Yale and the East Coast elitism and racism came as a shock to her. Yale was still a sexist place, as women had only been allowed in 1976. There was casual date rape and what we would now call sexual harassment, which was not fully codified at that time. Wolf describes the parties at Yale, which were very familiar to her, as people often got raped and molested at parties, referring to Brett Kavanaugh's hearings. Jordan Peterson asks her about the attitude of the typical male undergraduate at that point. Wolf says she is not sure if we would talk about the typical male undergraduate or a more dangerous one. She notes that a huge part of the fuel behind sexual misbehavior on campus is alcoholism, which is responsible for approximately 50% of violent crimes. The parties that she describes are alcohol-fueled and disinhibit people, amplifying underlying misogyny or resentment towards women. Naomi explains that the institutional toleration of such violence and harassment, rather than alcohol or drugs, was the root cause of the problem. The culture of impunity allowed perpetrators to feel like they could get away with their actions. This attitude was not limited to students, but also extended to faculty members who were protected by the institution. Naomi herself was molested by a famous professor, Harold Bloom, who had a reputation for doing so to undergraduate and graduate students. When she tried to seek accountability from the institution, it was covered up. Naomi was 19 at the time, and this had a lasting effect on her. She details how Bloom was her advisor and professor for an independent study course, and after ignoring her submissions for the semester, he offered to come to her house to discuss her manuscript. It was during this meeting that he assaulted her. Naomi mentions that this experience was reminiscent of treatment she had received at the hands of another man earlier in her life, which left her fearful and traumatized. She explains that during the experience, she was concerned about survival, as she did not know if the person was going to kill her. She describes it as a shocking and terrifying assault, and believes that those who run universities should understand this experience. Naomi also talks about how judges and administrators often misunderstand rape and sexual assault after the fact. She highlights the existential terror that comes with being molested by someone bigger than you are. Jordan Peterson acknowledges that there is an additional element of betrayal when you are attacked by someone who is trusted and in an institution that is supposed to develop and guide you. Naomi explains how when she reported the sexual assault to people around her, the response from the institution was that the rapist was well known for such behavior, and exposing him would ruin her career. This resulted in her career being destroyed, leaving her to take a detour for the next 3 decades. Jordan Peterson queries the mechanics of the impositions that were put in front of Naomi, and she explains that she could not get a letter of recommendation from her attacker, which communicated to her that she would not be able to pursue her career in literature because her attacker cast a gigantic shadow over the whole field. She mentioned a professor who had the power to ruin women's careers, even without any allegations being made against him. This professor closed every academic door for Wolf, making it clear to her that she had no future in her chosen field as long as he was alive. She was forced to become a feminist activist and a writer in a popular nonfiction genre, whereas her dream was to become a university professor of English literature. In her midlife, Wolf resumed her education and became a Rhodes Scholar, despite her past experiences. She finished her DPhil in Victorian Studies and submitted it to a Victorian Studies journal edited by Harold Bloom. However, she couldn't submit it to that journal because of her history with Bloom, who was allegedly the same professor that tried to ruin her career. Peterson asked her about how her past experiences impacted her writing, and how her writing aims would be if she didn't face those consequences. Wolf shared that all she ever wanted to do was teach, and that she would have stuck to classical literary criticism. She explained the significance of literary criticism, especially in recent years, to analyze the structures through which we view the world. Literary critics analyze stories, and they play a crucial role in helping people orient themselves in terms of where they devote their attention and action. Although she did get a Rhodes Scholarship, Wolf's ambitions to pursue a professorship in English literature were derailed. However, the Rhodes Scholarship Committee was looking for different things, not just credentials related to English literature. Naomi Wolf reflects on her experience pursuing a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford and pursuing her MPhil on Victorian Studies. Wolf notes that the Oxford experience is vastly different from that of American universities in that the learning experience is pure and academically rigorous. Seminars are small with only 2 or 3 students, a professor or don, and extensive textual analysis. Wolf's academic experience at Oxford was joyful and awakened the intellectual bliss within her. Despite the pure and rare experience, Wolf faced gender-based violence as rape with impunity happened, with consistency in the 1980s. She recalls how not even famous institutions such as Oxford were safe for women, and the urgency to work towards a culture that affirms the safety of women on and off campus. Naomi Wolf explains her master's thesis at Oxford, as well as her first book called The Beauty Myth. Her thesis was centered around the image of women in 19th century novels. Specifically, she explores the ideal of passive femininity that emerged during that time. This figure of an inert doll-like woman was present in virtually all great novels during that century. She highlights how this phenomenon occurred just as women were organizing to defeat laws that were punitive towards them, such as laws that allowed women who looked like prostitutes to be taken off the street without due process. Women were also mobilizing for their access to education and owning their own property. This ideal of passivity was a cultural backlash to women being empowered. Peterson also points out that in Tolstoy's novels, there is a sense that in the Victorian period and earlier in Imperial Russia, women were running society behind the scenes. In Tolstoy's world, men had the positions of formal nomenclature, but were actually appendages to what was truly going on. Women were running and gluing society together behind the scenes. Wolf agrees and adds that even though women did not have full legal rights in Imperial Russia, they could be portrayed in all of their complexity. Wolf hypothesizes that women were up above all European countries, advocating for their rights legally, socially, and economically, which is why the backlash figure emerged in Britain. In Imperial Russia, women had virtually no legal rights, so the backlash figure did not need to emerge, and they could be portrayed in all of their complexity. Wolf describes the Victorian English representation of women in literary domains as a backlash. She focused most on Dickens's doll-like characters and the common pairings in fiction in the middle of 19th century. Specifically, there's a pairing in which there was Dorothea Casaubon, who was complex and had rich inner life and worked hard to change society, and her kind of antagonist was usually a pretty, blonde, passive, manipulative, superficial character. She notes that this dialectic exists in other novels at that time and in popular culture as well. Additionally, it was the dawn of pop culture in the sense of lithography, and pretty soon photography by the 1840s and 1850s. Beauty ideals began to emerge which were impossible to achieve, such as having 17-inch waists due to corsets that restricted breathing. The fashion of the mid-19th century contrasted to that of the early 1800s, when women could move around freely and express themselves fully, even though they had no legal rights. Women of the 1850s wore hoop skirts, layers of petticoats, and corsets that restricted their breathing. They also had to wear heavy clothing and change their clothes multiple times a day if they were middle class. All this hampering fashion added to the emergence of the backlash figure of passive femininity. The discussion switches to a question about the impact of syphilis on the conceptualization of relationships between men and women during the Victorian period in England. The guests explain that syphilis became a widespread public health concern among the Victorians and was a significant factor in changing sexual mores during this period. The fear of syphilis transformed the relationships between men and women politically and socially and made prostitution a much greater public health danger. The guests also discussed the impact of excess resources on the Victorian outfitting front and how some of the Victorian excesses are manifestations of exuberance of display on the sexual front. The guests also touch on the use of viral epidemics, including syphilis and gonorrhea, by the state as a pretext for controlling people and subverting civil liberties during the 19th century. They argue that the source of the Contagious Diseases Acts was the state's argument for managing and controlling prostitutes or women who looked like prostitutes. The state's role was to step into very personal spaces and mediate this for the public good. The conversation then shifts to the relationship between infectious diseases and authoritarian political beliefs. The guests discuss the emergent literature on the political biological front, indicating that one of the best predictors of authoritarian political beliefs in any given geographical locale is the prevalence of infectious disease. The higher the prevalence of infectious disease, the higher the probability of authoritarian political attitudes. They explain that disgust is a lot more aggressive than fear and is a powerful motivational system when it gets activated. The discussion touches on Hitler and his minions' language and how they used parasitism, disgust, and contamination regarding public health pathology, prevention pathology, to extend out of the mental asylums and hospitals into more broad ethnic cleansing. Naomi believes this happens on two fronts: the psychological front and the state which takes advantage of the existential threat to restrict people's rights. She points out that Hitler and other exploiters extensively used the state narrative in the past. They highlight the success of the state in controlling infectious diseases during the 19th century. Jordan adds that the spread of information is the same as a virus, and information spreading like a virus is why it's referred to as going viral. There is always a real tension in human discourse between contamination and free exchange. Conservatives tend to be more sensitive to danger, and they believe that free exchange will be trumped by contamination. On the other hand, Liberals believe the advantage of a free exchange of ideas will outperform the negative consequences of contamination. They mention that the tension between liberals and conservatives' views is continually shifting. Conservatives are more correct when multiple epidemics are raging out of control, and the liberals are more correct when the probability of contamination is low. IQ is associated with disgust sensitivity. That is, the lower the IQ, the more disgust sensitive the individual is. On the ideation land, the physical front, people have distinct reactions to contamination and free exchange. Lastly, they discuss the horrifying public health concern that underlay the progressive campaign towards ethnic extermination in Germany. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of The Pod Slice.